Cynthia, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've really been looking forward to this.
I'm outnumbered on this podcast because we've got two Virginia natives here.
It always feels good to have the Virginia coalition here.
Great state of Virginia, definitely. I mean, I've spent more time in Virginia in my lifetime than I did where I grew up. So I always say that, I was born in the South and grew up in the Northeast and then moved back to the South. And that's where I shall remain.
Where'd you grow up?
New Jersey. So the Jersey.
I'm from Jersey, so now it's connected.
Yeah. No, grew up in Ocean and Monmouth County. And I knew when I left for college that and I love my friends there, my family, but I have a wanderlusting kind of mindset and always love Washington, D.C. So I've been in either D.C. or Baltimore or Northern Virginia for most of my adult lifetime and love it. Love everything about that part of the East Coast.
Nice. I'm actually from Princeton and my mom grew up in Point Pleasant. She went to Point Pleasant Beach High School.
Oh, so funny.
Yeah,
that's where we used to hang out. It's changed a lot since.
It really has.
Yeah, it's really grown up. And what's ironic is nearly every single friend I went to high school with, they all go off to college and they all come back. So like very few people leave the great state of New Jersey, but I was definitely one of them.
Definitely. And we were saying too, Cynthia, that we were fortunate enough to get to hear you speak at KetoCon in July of this past summer. And we're just amazed at your perspective on nutrition, especially from a female perspective. And I think our audience is going to love this episode because you're a nurse, you're trained as a nurse practitioner. So you came up through conventional medicine and then had some of your own health issues that really made you look at the lens of intermittent fasting and animal protein, saturated fat. So I think that this is going to be an amazing episode for our listeners to learn more about your story. So if we want to just start there and tell us a little bit about yourself, and I think that'll lead to an amazing conversation.
Yeah. So the background about kind of the trajectory of my career has really been focused on being a bit of an adrenaline junkie. So I trained in Inner City, Baltimore, was an ER nurse for many years, loved everything about the unpredictability and the intenseness of being there. And so it was a natural transition to move into cardiology as an NP. And I did that for 16 years. And after having children, I just really started to change my perspective about nutrition. I have a child with life-threatening food allergies, and that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole. And really, it was a disappointing thing as a clinician to kind of go through the medical model with a sick child. He was healthy, but he obviously had some allergies, and to really understand that there's not a whole lot that protects our children from things that they're exposed to in their environment that can make them more susceptible to developing food allergies. And if you look at the statistics on food allergies as an example, they're increasing in prevalence and incidence. And certainly my son, who has grown up with peanut and tree nut allergies, that really shifted my focus into looking more at food, because I kept saying to pediatrician and the allergist, I was like, is anything I'm giving him, any well-meaning parent is going to be, we always kind of reflect on ourselves first. So, obviously Jack's food allergies got me more focused on nutrition and food, and that sent me down a rabbit hole. I started a PhD program. That wasn't the right fit. I did a wellness coaching program that didn't really strike a chord. And then I read a book called Eat the Yolks, and I actually reached out to the author and said, where did you get your training? And I started to realize what really got me excited was to talk about nutrition. And so I did a functional nutrition program. And then in 2016, after many, many years of taking care of patients, I grew really wary of writing prescriptions. As you can imagine, in cardiology, we have a lot of very sick patients, not a lot of focus on prevention. And I just couldn't write another script. Although when I was at work, I kind of, towed the party line of traditional allopathic medicine, and there's certainly a place for it. But we don't do a great job with prevention, and we certainly don't do a fantastic job with chronic disease management. And so I took a leap of faith in 2016 and left clinical cardiology, started my own business. That led to many things. Almost instantaneously, I started attracting women just like myself who in their late 30s, early 40s felt like they were stuck. And what actually led me to intermittent fasting was I was that late 30s, early 40s woman who had never struggled with weight loss resistance, that all of a sudden, all the advice I'd been giving my patients, I realized didn't really effectively work per se. And so intermittent fasting was a strategy that I started way before I left clinical medicine, but one that initially I felt so good doing it. I didn't initially lose weight. I like to be really upfront with that to give it patience, but I was so cognitively clear and I had so much energy that I just kept with it. And so when I left clinical medicine in 2016, intermittent fasting was just something I naturally talked about with anyone that was willing to talk to me about it. And from there, I created group programs and one-on-one work. And then in 2018, I decided to do a TED Talk, not realizing that was going to change everything. And so I did my first in 2018, my second in 2019, which just recently crested over 14 million views, which is still hard to believe. Really, as an introvert, I really did it just to challenge myself, but has led to a lot of wonderful opportunities. Created, a couple podcasts. I've been able to speak on stages where I've been able to connect with wonderful individuals like yourself. But what I always started, or kind of started the whole process of becoming an entrepreneur, was I wanted to make larger impact. And I feel like I really do have the ability to do so, to speak on behalf of women and men, when it's appropriate, but to let women know that they have, there's a voice in the world out there that has a solid, medical background, but also have definitely pivoted into like a functional integrative approach, and just helping people create sustainable strategies that they can do throughout their lifetime, as opposed to the latest potion, pill, or powder, which we all know is not effective long-term.
Yeah. What a great backstory. I feel like your backstory kind of encapsulates this idea or ethos of experimentation and self-experimentation, whether it's your business pursuits or career pursuits or just your own personal health. And I'm curious, a lot of people have come to fasting, but what made you, like, when did the light bulb go off that it was really something that you wanted to continue to pursue and learn more about?
Yeah, well, I think that reading Jason Fung's book, and so I always give Jason Fung credit for being the first clinician that was utilizing it therapeutically. And so I read his book, The Complete Guide to Fasting, and I thought to myself, he's a physician. We have similar training. He's seeing such great success. That gave me the confidence to feel like it was something I could certainly embrace. But why do I continue being a proponent, and why do I continue to fast? Because there's just so many benefits. And I think many people come to intermittent fasting because they want to change body composition, they want to lose weight, and they end up staying for all the other benefits, many of which they may not be familiarized with. And so for me personally, I just think that it allows me to live a better moderated life. I don't feel like I have to, I don't have to be thinking about food constantly. And I think when I was in that kind of traditional methodology, I'd go to the gym, I have a shake, go to the gym, I have a shake. When I'm done with the gym, I have like a mini meal, then I have lunch. I mean, it was just, there was so much meal prep and so much thought process around food that allows you to have food freedom. And so for me, I ate one meal in the morning and one in the late afternoon, and that's about how my schedule works. So to me, it's all about simplification and certainly efficiency. But I think Jason Fung's book definitely is one of those things that gave me that opportunity to really leap and feel comfortable doing so.
Let's take a minute to talk about some of the sponsors and brands who support the show.
Who are you thinking?
I was thinking about Carnivore Bar. What are your thoughts on Carnivore Bar?
I mean, it's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable product. We were lucky enough to have the founder, Philip Meese, on the show a few months ago, and he was able to send us a bunch of product when we started the relationship and absolutely loved it. I mean, it's minimum ingredient product, beef, tallow, salt, and then they do have a honey flavored option as well, but it's so nice to have a bar that's like 3 to 4 ingredients. And like when you're following a carnivore diet, it's really tough to find products that are in line with that specific diet,
Yeah, for me, it kind of hits like the holy trinity of what you're looking for when you're looking for food. So it's nutrient dense, it's convenient, and it tastes great. And as you said, most people who are trying to eat healthy, the convenience factor is kind of a tough part. So just being able to have something you can grab on the go, know that you're going to have that nutrition for the day, it's huge.
Yeah, and we were lucky enough, we got to actually see their factory too in Missouri, and they're just doing things the right way. I love how they offer an option for like carnivore purists where it's just beef, tallow, salt. And then they also have an animal-based option too. If you do want a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of variety, they have the honey in that option. And they're just people that are doing things the right way. They're very mission focused. They're carnivores themselves. And, we're always on the go. We're traveling. We've taken a bunch of flights together. To have a bar that has 30 grams of fat too, like that's huge from an energy density standpoint, right?
Yeah, he checks all the boxes, or the company checks all the boxes. And I just think the fact that they're sourcing from a regenerative farm as well, and Joyce Farms, just a win-win.
100%. So Carnivore Bar. So we got the affiliate link, and then it's code MAFIA for 10% off.
One of the other farms that supports us is Perennial Pastures, another regenerative farm out of San Diego. Our experience with Kevin Munoz, the owner, we had him on the show. a young first generation rancher who's really empowered by this movement of regenerative agriculture and really wants to be a leader in the space. I think our conversation with him was so insightful just in terms of how mission focused he is and how he really thinks about his farm as a business and wanting it to be here 50, 100 years down the road, even though he's just the first generation of it. And I think just being able to spend time with him out in San Diego was kind of the perfect indication of that, where we got to go have a meal with him at his house, hang out with his wife and kids. Like, what an amazing person. And I think his mission focus around raising really high quality beef and restoring nutrients to the soil is just one of those rare missions that I think everyone can get around.
Yeah, he has such a commitment to really feeding the local community in San Diego, in the San Diego County first and foremost, but he's also passionate about feeding the community around the country. So I know they've invested a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources to being able to order beef in bulk on their website. So I know that they now offer quarter, half, whole cows directly off the website. They have that great ancestral blend ground beef product. So it actually has organ grinds mixed into the ground beef. So you're getting the benefits of like an ounce or so of organ meat, but because it's in the ground beef, you really can't taste it at all. And I think to your point, Harry, just another amazing person. You know, Kev was someone that he was following a paleo diet in college and started realizing, wow, when I nourish my body with real foods, I feel amazing. Had a really successful stint in tech, but realized that there was just something else that he was passionate about. So he's one of those rare cases where, you know, he put his money where his mouth is, and he's a first generation farmer, just, you know, bootstrapping this thing, raising money, and just so passionate about feeding the community. Just an amazing guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening. Now we're going to go back to the show.
Cynthia, it seems like in the context of intermittent fasting, it's very widely accepted with men. But with women in particular, it seems to be extremely controversial. And I don't know why that is. So I would just love to learn more about that from your perspective. Like, why is it so controversial?
Oh, there's so much fear mongering that goes on. And I have to believe, I mean, I'm an optimist. I have to believe it's well-meaning people that want to fear monger women, but I find it, frankly, frustrating. If we weren't able to get by on less food and eating less often, we wouldn't be here as a species. However, the caveat is women are much more sensitive to the cues that we take in from our environment. So if you are a 25-year-old woman that's doing CrossFit 4 or 5 days a week and you think you can fast every day, I can pretty much guarantee you that, you know, we talk about hormesis, this role of beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time, that you are probably going to deplete your body. However, there are also times in your menstrual cycle when younger women can get by with some fasting. Obviously, there's therapeutic fasting for women with polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, or women that are insulin resistant, can be exceedingly beneficial. But I think a lot of the fear mongering stems around from a lack of understanding of what is going on physiologically with women's bodies, both in their peak fertile years, 35 and under, women in perimenopause, the 10 to 15 years preceding menopause. And then it gets more interesting because women that are 12 months without a menstrual cycle in menopause and men have a lot more similarities in terms of there's not as much hormonal fluctuation day to day, week to week. And I sometimes feel that women that are menopausal and men have the easiest time with fasting. Now, is this to suggest that every woman out there should fast? Absolutely not. There's a time to fast. There are cues that let us know whether or not fasting is a good strategy for us. I'll give you some examples. Like, I don't believe that pregnant breastfeeding women should be fasting. It's if you're feeding a human or growing a human, that's not the time to restrict your macronutrients. I think that's really important. Versus if a woman is, let's say she's perimenopausal, she's 20 pounds up from, her baseline weight, she's becoming insulin resistant, she's dialing in everything else, she's sleeping well, her macros are on point, she's managing her stress, she's lifting weights frequently, a couple days a week, then that can be a really effective strategy to use versus the perimenopausal woman who is not sleeping, can't manage her stress, does chronic cardio. I always think about the women in my old neighborhood that would run 5 or 10 miles every day, and they'd wonder why in their 40s that stopped working for them. They weren't willing to do the weights, but they would run all these miles and they just would look so haggard. So it's all about the right amount of beneficial stress at the right time and understanding that as we are changing where we are in our lifetime, we have to make adjustments. And it's not saying that you're incapable. It just means we're a little less stress resilient. And so I like women and men to understand that that intermittent fasting can be an effective strategy, but with the caveat of where are you in the menstrual cycle? How are you doing with your lifestyle things? Because that can make a big net impact on whether or not that's effective.
What are your thoughts on the different types of fasting? Like I've personally done a bone broth fast, a dry fast, and I think they're both beneficial. But do you think from your perspective, they have different benefits?
Definitely. I mean, dry fasting is, let me just put a little caveat. Dry fasting is unique. Obviously, there are people during Ramadan that will abide by dry fasting, hard dry fasting, and kind of loose dry fasting. The hard dry fasting means that you are not even showering. You are not exposing yourself to any water that can be absorbed through your skin, which I think is a little bit extreme. When you're talking about soft dry fasting, it's people that are just not going to consume any liquids in a fasted state. And I do think of this as a more advanced strategy because you have to stay really well hydrated up to the point of doing dry fasting to be able to make that successful. Some of us are just so sensitive to dehydration that won't be effective, but we know it can actually upregulate fat oxidation. And so I always like to think about Dr. Rick Johnson, who talks about the camels in the desert. Everyone assumes they have water in their humps. It's actually fat. And so the way that the camels stay hydrated is they can actually break down this fat and they can hydrate their bodies. So I do think dry fasting has its place. I think of it as a more advanced strategy. I like bone broth fasting because for some people, that's what allows them to be able to do longer fasts, meaning, maybe they're fasting for better digestion or they want to be able to potentiate the benefits of going a little longer. They're still consuming food, but it's at a very low level. So I think bone broth fast can certainly, for many people, that may be their segue into be able to do longer fasts. From my perspective, it's all about like, what are your goals? For me personally, I don't do a lot of longer fasts because I'm not willing to lose muscle mass to be able to fast longer. I was in the hospital 4 years ago for 13 days. And I like to tell people that's the longest fast I've ever done. And I will never do another long fast again because I lost 15 pounds of muscle in the first week. So, because my body was catabolizing all this muscle in order to give my body some food. So I think it's always in the context of what are your goals. For a lot of people, they want the longevity benefits. But if you look at a lot of most of the longevity researchers that are out there, they're kind of skinny. And it's because they, maybe they're having one meal a day, maybe they're doing these longer fasts, and I respect their work, but I think muscle is always my focus. Like I understand the interrelationship between maintaining lean muscle mass and the role with insulin sensitivity, as well as locomotion, like just being able to move your body is so important. So I think there's a very kind of careful, conscientious way that you have to approach different types of fasting, depending on the individual. Like I don't want to be any thinner than I am. I want to maintain the lean muscle that I have. If you're someone that is insulin resistant or diabetic, you can get away with longer fasts. And I think for some of those people, it's a really great way to kind of recalibrate their palates so that they're ready to kind of get some skin in the game, literally, to be able to, break down some stored fat, to be able to burn it off and lose some weight.
Cynthia, how important is it for women to be maintaining muscle mass?
Oh, so important. And not enough people talk about this. I mean, the concept of sarcopenic obesity, which is a fancy way of saying muscle loss with aging. And so I always like to use this visualization. I have teenage boys. They're very athletic. When you're a late teens, when you're building muscle, you're in this massive anabolic phase, 20s and 30s. Your muscle looks like a nice fillet, right? It's mostly muscle, very little fat, very lean. Versus what happens to us is if we're not working against this, we are replacing muscle with adipose tissue, which we know is highly inflammatory. It is its own endocrine organ. It is very sophisticated. It's not just fat. So understanding that when you look at a ribeye, as delicious as it is with all that marbling, that's kind of what starts to happen to your muscles as you're getting older. So for me, I like women to understand our peak bone and muscle mass years are in our 20s and 30s. How many women are on oral contraceptives, which are synthetic hormones, which are endocrine disruptors? We don't do a great job explaining to our patients that this is going to dampen these peak muscle and bone building years. And many women stay on these, and rightfully so. I took oral contraceptives because I had wonky periods and stayed on them until I was married. I didn't realize, even as a clinician, that was never explained to me what they actually did, that you keep such a low level of estrogen that you're really not able to build muscle as effectively as you could if you weren't on them. But as women are getting older, north of 40 is so common to see sarcopenia develop. And so I remind women, like, if you're not building muscle in your 20s and 30s, you're going to play catch up in your 40s. And you're really at kind of sometimes a hormonal disadvantage. As we are having fluctuations in progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen, that can impact how we build muscle. As we have changes in insulin resistance. So for many women, they may not have been insulin resistant before, but as they are losing muscle mass, they lose insulin sensitivity. And so I really try to make sure people understand that weight training is a non-negotiable. It is so important to lift heavy enough for you, right? The end of one, eat enough protein and get high quality sleep so that you can help build and repair those muscles. I think far too many women are still afraid they're going to look like a man. Yes. And I have to remind them, like, there's really no way that would happen physiologically. We have more testosterone than we do other hormones, but it's much more potent. We don't need as much as men. So unless we are taking exogenous testosterone, there's really no way that we are going to be able to develop musculature to look like a guy. That's just not going to happen. With that being said, I'm also a proponent for people understanding that the changes in body composition that start for women in their 40s and into their 50s are largely driven by these hormonal fluctuations. And so I also always talk about testosterone. That helps with body composition, helps with muscle, building lean muscle, helps with, attention. It helps with, just the desire to get out of bed and go. And as that's kind of fluctuating, women will say, I just don't have the desire to go to the gym. Okay, well, we have to create that desire. That needs to be a non-negotiable. Same thing with estrogen. Estrogen is, helpful with in terms of anabolism, so kind of building up muscle. But as we're losing that, especially as we're the latter stages of perimenopause, that can really accelerate the process, along with loss of insulin sensitivity, higher blood sugar, high cortisol, because gosh, if anyone's coming out of the last 3 years and didn't have more stress in their lives, they certainly do now, or they have, in the past 3 years, understanding the interrelationship of chronic stress and how that leads to high blood sugar. And then the higher blood sugar means more insulin secretion. And so that also kind of puts a damper on being able to break down fats, stored fat for fuel source. So there's many things that contribute to this. Again, I think there's so much misinformation, but I think the more women understand about what's happening in their bodies, the more it makes sense some of the recommendations that myself and other peers are making for this community.
Before we get into the episode, let's talk about Fawn Bone Broth's carnivore blend.
100%. Yeah, we've been huge fans of bone broth the last few months. It's really fueled our carnivore journey. Bone broth is incredibly nourishing, especially on a carnivore, animal-based, or just any type of diet, to be honest with you. And what's great about Fawn is that they're a very simple, pure product. So their product is just boiled bones, water, salt, and most of their products have spices like turmeric, cayenne, cracked pepper, but they actually just came out with their carnivore broth, which is very simple, chicken bone broth, water, and salt too. So they're eliminating all their spices and just giving you something very pure that won't disrupt the gut.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talk about with the elimination diet is the fact that there's so many things that do actually affect how your body reacts to the food you put in your body. And the fact that they're just doing a pure bone broth with bones and just the minimal ingredients, I think is huge. And the carnivore audience will love this one. Fawn does regenerative bone, so it's really high quality stuff. Go check it out. Use our promo code in the link below.
Yep, code MAFIA will get you 15% off your first order.
I definitely want to come back to the stress topic because I think it's so important. I think a lot of people understate how important it is in terms of just the whole entire makeup of what being a healthy person is. But you had mentioned oral contraceptions in women, and what's we've seen popular online is like this trend of like male hormonal health being in this like depleted state. Is that the same case for women's health? Like, do you see this like hormonal problem happening on the female side of the equation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is driven by insulin resistance for both men and women. Like the two number one reasons why men have low testosterone or low T, insulin resistance and endocrine mimicking chemicals in our personal care products, environment, and food. And I would say for women, I think it's so many different things. Like as an example, PCOS is the number one endocrine disorder in the world. I thought it was thyroid. I was shocked to hear that. It's a polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is is an issue with inflammation and insulin resistance, and we need to call it what it is. I do see a lot of women that are given synthetic hormones and they don't realize that synthetic hormones, so progestin is not the same as progesterone. Premarin, pregnant mare's urine, is not the same as estradiol, which is the predominant form of estrogen that women make prior to menopause. And so I think there needs to be better conversations between providers and patients. I think men and women need to be doing a better job advocating for themselves. I think I've been guilty of this myself. I never even questioned the fact I was on oral contraceptives. They were fixing my menstrual cycle, which was wonky and all over the place. But I think for a lot of people, it's understanding that it's not just insulin, it's not just cortisol, it's not just sex hormones, but it's crappy sleep and low melatonin, which is also a master antioxidant. It's not just a sleep hormone. It's impacting leptin and ghrelin, which are these appetite and satiety hormones. There's so many things, thyroid hormones, so many things that are impacted by our modern day lifestyles that people don't even realize are having a negative net impact on their health.
Mm-hmm. Cynthia, for a woman that's listening to this that really wants to optimize her fertility and get pregnant in the near future, outside of like getting off of birth control and optimizing sleep, are there any nutritional changes that you recommend that she makes, or maybe just general lifestyle changes as well?
Yeah. So I think, it's really starting with a foundational approach. So sleep, managing stress, trying to be mindful of the endocrine mimicking chemicals that we're exposed to. So don't lessen the amount of plastic in your life. Be conscientious. Environmental Working Group has a great app called Skin Deep. So you can look at your deodorant, your lotion, your toothpaste, etc. Making clean swaps, not feeling like you have to do everything all at once, but certainly making some changes. I would say in terms of nutrition, it's really all about protein and healthy fats. I'm not anti-carb for women. I think that there are a lot of people out there that they do keto, like really low keto, like under 30 grams of carbohydrate a day. I don't per se think that necessarily works for everyone as a sustainable strategy forever, maybe therapeutically for a period of time. That's why I'm a fan of carb cycling. I think that can be very helpful. That kind of bridges the gap of people who are feeling like they want a piece of fruit. They don't want to feel guilty about having a piece of fruit. They shouldn't feel guilty about having a piece of fruit. But as it pertains, based on the research that I have read, I really think high quality animal-based protein, really, leaning into 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal, not under eating. I think there are a lot of women who still get by on 1,000 calories a day. That's not the way you're going to be able to nourish your body. That's not the way you're going to be able to nourish a pregnancy. Even if I'd known about fasting or thought about fasting, it would not have been something I would have embraced as a trying to conceive pregnant or breastfeeding woman. It's almost like with breastfeeding, I tell people it's the only time in my adult life that I could eat like a linebacker. Like I have all teenage boys and the amount of food they eat on a daily basis is unbelievable, but they're growing. And so it's very similar to understand, like you're eating high quality food. You shouldn't have to be restrictive, but I think far too many women are over exercising and they're under restricting their food intake. And I think that can have a really detrimental net impact on their fertility and chances of conceiving.
Can you touch on that over exercising piece? Does that play into kind of the stress component that you were talking about?
Yeah, I call it the triad. So it's the over fasting, over restricting, over exercising. And it's this kind of mindset of if a little bit of fasting or exercise or over restriction of food is good, more is better. And so it's usually a traditional kind of mindset I see in my super type A, achievement oriented women who want to be super thin. They've got this idealized perspective. They need to be the weight they were at 18. I don't know why. They want to be that size they were at 18. They want that number on the scale. They're willing to do anything and everything to make that happen. And I just have to remind them that can be incredibly detrimental. I think that we have to view fasting and, therapeutic nutritional changes as a form of hormesis. So beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. It also means hormesis has a dual-edged sword. You can overdo it. And so this is where I kind of get concerned when women don't understand that doing CrossFit, I'm going to pick on CrossFit just because it's what flew into my head. CrossFit 5 days a week with no rest periods, no rest at all. They just work out. They're exhausted. They're tired. They lose their menstrual cycle. They're not sleeping well. Well, you better believe if your body thinks you are overtraining, your cortisol is not, well, initially will go up and then it will come down in response to that. But it can also make it very hard for people to lose weight. So they become increasingly more cortisol resistant. And so next thing you know, their blood sugar goes up, their insulin goes up, they've got a cortisol belly. We have 40 times more cortisol receptors on our abdomen, and they're wondering why everything that used to work is no longer working for them. So I think women in particular have to be careful and conscientious, even if they're choosing not to have children at that point in their lives. Their body's exquisitely attuned to the cues of stress in our environment. And so that can be detrimental. And I find for a lot of women, when they come to me and they're like, fasting isn't working. Okay, when we dial back, they're not sleeping more than 4 to 5 hours a night. They're eating like 900 calories a day. And I don't encourage anyone to count calories. It's really like when they start running through their macros, I'm like, I don't know how I couldn't, that's like one meal. Like what you're eating in one day is like such a small amount of food. And sometimes you have to kind of reverse diet them. You have to slowly build them up, or maybe they're having 100 more calories a day of protein and slowly kind of build them back up. And I call it reverse dieting. It's not really a scientific principle, but I found with a lot of my personal training friends and other physicians that I talk to that sometimes that's how you have to kind of get yourself out of that. But there are far too many women that have gotten by for years with undereating.
Is there a different nutritional framework that you have for a woman that's pre/post menopause?
I would say perimenopause and menopause. So 10 to 15 years preceding menopause and menopause, more protein, less carbs, more healthy fats, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're eating copious amounts of fats. And it's important to remind people that when we're looking at calories per gram, I don't encourage anyone to count calories. However, protein and carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram and healthy fats are 9. So just to give you an idea, like you don't need a lot of healthy fats to have a portion. And that's why I will sometimes recommend that women understand like a portion of nuts is not half a bag. Butter is delicious, but we don't have half a stick. Yes, the cheese is good, but we don't have 5 ounces of cheese. Like you can overdo it very easily with seemingly innocuous, benign foods. And so, from my perspective, it's really all about protein. We know that women need more protein as they get older, not less. You don't go by the RDA. That's complete garbage. That's like the minimum recommended amount so you don't die. That's really what that's looking at. So I remind women, if you look at the research, as women's estrogen levels are falling, as their follicular stimulating hormone is going up, they need more protein. Because if you're not getting it from protein, guess what? Your body's going to be trying to get you to eat it from other things. And so sometimes that's when people will overeat the carbohydrates and the fats. And I always say that is why I'm really, really deliberate about my middle-aged women getting 40 to 60 grams of protein with every meal. And that's why I don't like OMAD. I don't like OMAD as a sustained strategy. I may make a couple people angry, but there's no way that most women, I can't speak for men, there's no way that most women can get 100, 120, 150 grams of protein in one meal. I can't. I have to divide it between 2. There's just no way I can do that.
So that's what's worked for you is you really like the 2 meals a day?
Yes, 2 meals. For some of my patients, they do 3. If they're really, very active and it's in the right time in their menstrual cycle, they can get away with 3. But it's always about protein. You want to have at least 30 grams of protein. And you want to have that ratio of leucine to be able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. I also think there's this narrative that's going on right now about, making people feel guilty for eating animal-based protein and, encouraging people to have a lot of plant-based protein and they're not the same. That's all I will say. I'll respectfully say they are not. The amino acid composition is not the same.
I like what you've been saying about kind of the psychology behind food, because I think it speaks to one of the major issues that a lot of people have, which is just in general, their relationship with food isn't all that healthy. It's not even really what they're putting in their body. It's just like they like try to white knuckle themselves into being healthier. And I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of like methods that you use to make some of these habits stick? So fasting is obviously one of them, but is there anything else that you use to help people kind of get into the flow of like reorienting themselves around how they think about food?
Yeah, such a good question. Well, I think the reframe really has to start with what are your goals and what's sustainable, because I see a lot of well-meaning people out there that try to give people these massive plans that are overwhelming. They get lost in what do I do first? What do I do second? So I like to keep things really simple. And so when I'm working with women, it's like, what is sustainable? That's why I'm not a proponent of people doing really low carb forever, unless that's what they need in order to stay healthy. I think it's important to bump yourself out of ketosis. That's why I'm a fan of carbohydrate cycling. I think it's really very much bio-individualized. So I'll give you an example. I have a new patient and we were talking today and trying to get a sense of like what would be reasonable and feasible for her. So we usually pick low-lying fruit first. So sleep is absolutely foundational. So I'll usually work there first. And I always say, if I can't get you to sleep through the night, I can't get you to lose weight. Mm-hmm. So that's usually how I get people to really focus on sleeping as a really important piece. Other like low-lying things are, what's your relationship with alcohol? There's no judgment on my part, but I see far too many people in this kind of drinking culture, and they don't realize that the 3 wines they have 3 nights a week is completely derailing their weight loss efforts. Largely because our bodies prioritize alcohol as a toxin. Everything else that you've just eaten and kind of gets shuttled into fat storage mode. It also disrupts REM sleep. There's a lot of study research now that's starting to identify what it does in the brain, in particular. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but sometimes alcohol portion sizes is another thing. People that really love cheese and nuts. I'm sure you see it too, happens with men. How many people don't understand that half a cup of nuts or a cup of nuts or half a block of cheese could be the one thing that is making it really challenging. So I usually say be very conscientious about your fat portions. And then the other thing that I would say is just being deliberate about protein intake. I feel like, hitting those protein macros for many people is what makes a huge difference between where they are now and where they are, 2 or 3 months from now. So I think I try to really keep it simple. And in terms of fasting, my traditional kind of methodology is you go from no snacking to, then kind of re-strategizing your meals. So more protein, less carbohydrates, adjusting your fats based on what the protein is. Obviously, you have a ribeye or salmon, you don't need more healthy fats. And that's another common misnomer about keto and low carb. People just overdo it on fats. And then going from dinner to breakfast without eating, and then slowly kind of opening up that fasting window to, I try to get to 16 hours is always the goal. That's an achievable goal. And then everything else will usually fall into place. But I try to keep the message really simple so that people don't feel so overwhelmed, because I've seen what happens when I don't do that. And then people are like, I can't do anything. I can't do anything at all because it's too complicated. There's too many things I have to change all at once. And then people they kind of tune you out.
It's a great perspective. And it's definitely something that we see in the low carb community. There are people that are pushing you to eat so much fat and almost shaming you to not eat protein, or saying that protein kicks you out of ketosis, or some of the other rationales or arguments that are out there. But we've always felt our best when we prioritize protein. We definitely get a good amount of fat in, but 1 gram to 1.2 grams of protein per pound of body weight has worked really well for us. So it's great to hear you say that.
Yeah. And I think it's all about honoring our own bio-individuality. So for me, I don't do well with duck fat. I don't do well with lard or tallow. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was at an event this past weekend, and this very nice woman had made so I don't tolerate dairy. So she had this protein powder, and right before she put it in the glass, she said, I added some tallow. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'll feel sick. It's just too heavy for me. So avocados, olive oil, macadamia nuts, I do fine with. And there are people out there that probably love duck fat fries, which last time I ate those, I was nauseous and sick. And I have a very healthy gallbladder. Before anyone sends me messages out of concern, nothing wrong with my gallbladder. It's just my body doesn't do well with heavier fats. And I think it's honoring what makes our bodies feel good and what doesn't make our bodies feel good. And I 100% agree with you that a lot of people get keto wrong when they're just eating copious amounts of butter and copious amounts of bacon. And I love bacon, don't get me wrong, or really fatty meat. And they wonder why they're packing on pounds. And I'm has a lot to do with fat is one of those levers. You can have protein and healthy fats, but it can't be too much of it. It can definitely be tricky. Same thing. It's protein is always the consistent piece with meals. It's either, a higher adjustment of carbs or a higher adjustment of fats. And that's kind of how I usually kind of strategize.
Yeah. I know everyone's metabolically unique, and I don't want you to give a blanket answer, but do you have any just general recommendations for fat consumption?
I think a lot of it depends on if you're at a healthy weight. I think having a sense of what a serving is important. I don't per se measure a whole lot of anything, but I know exactly what a quarter cup of macadamia nuts looks like. I know what a tablespoon of butter looks like. I know what a tablespoon of olive oil looks like. And I think for some people, it's that realization. I think it's really dependent on who you like. What life stage are you in? Are you a young male versus a menopausal female? Middle age, it just starts to shift. It's not to suggest that I don't enjoy good food, but it shows up a whole lot more easily than it did when I was in my 20s and 30s. And so I think it's building awareness about portion sizes in general. Like I always say, plate the protein first, and then whatever is left on the plate, then the room is kind of what you widget, whether it's a day of higher carbs, maybe you're having spaghetti squash or sweet potato. You're going to notice I talk a lot about unprocessed carbohydrates, carbohydrates that have some fiber, they're going to keep you full, versus a day, maybe you're having a little more fat with your meal and you're going to have non-starchy vegetables. I'm a huge proponent of eating vegetables. I do think that there's value in that. I was full carnivore for 9 months in 2019, and I really missed vegetables. So I think there's a degree of experimentation, but for many people, they've never even thought about what a portion size is. So it can feel a little cumbersome. I do like the app Chronometer if people are trying to get very granular about how much food they're eating and what their portion sizes are like. That's a great app. It's free. And that'll actually break down macros and micros. So you'll get a breakdown of how much potassium, how much sodium is in a food. And I think that can be really enlightening.
Mm. You mentioned a book earlier called Eat the Yolk, and I'm curious what it was about that book that spoke to you and kind of changed your paradigm around nutrition.
Well, I think it was all about nutrient density. That kind of blew my mind. It was like, all of a sudden, what do you mean? Like all the foods that we bastardized, all these anti-fat foods. I was telling people to eat Brummel and Brown and vegetable oil spreads, and fat was bad. And this was telling people like, eat the yolks, eat the butter, eat the milk, eat that saturated fat that's in that meat. And so it was so contrary to everything I had learned. And I actually cringe. I came across in the midst of a move some of the handouts that the NP service had made in this cardiology practice. And I was like, oh my God, this is awful. Like low fat, non-fat, no one should eat that stuff. What do you think happens when they take the fat out? They add a lot more sugar to make it palatable. And so just understanding that, Ansel Keys and the 7 countries study really got this country really derailed in terms of focusing in on the wrong things, focusing in on healthy fats as opposed to the sugar that has effectively created a very metabolically unhealthy society.
Yeah, it's like when you go to a diner and they have the skinny omelet on the menu and it's like egg whites and broccoli, and you're like, this tastes terrible. And there's you literally just sucked all the nutrition out of it.
Exactly. The only time I will ask for an egg white omelet is if I'm out with my family and I don't want a heavy meal, if maybe we're hiking or doing something. Otherwise, yeah, I totally agree with you. But then I'm the person that's like, can I have some sausage? Can I have some bacon? Like I need some fat. It is so bland. Or hot sauce for that matter. I know with you both being in Texas, you understand that. But sometimes when I have to call for hot sauce to get it through eating an omelet, I'm like, oh boy, this is not a good sign.
100%. Cynthia, something that you mentioned earlier was the second TED Talk that a lot of people know you for because it went viral. You'd mentioned that it has 14 million views, which is unbelievable. But what I think a lot of people may not know is that you had a pretty scary health experience, like less than a month to that. And if you would be comfortable sharing just that journey and just some of the things that you learned and your ability to heal from that, I think that would be really powerful for a lot of people.
Yeah. So in February of 2019, I had, for the first time, was able to go with my husband on one of his business trips. And we went to Hawaii. So that was great. And when I came back, my mom was still with us, but I woke up one night and I was like, oh, I got food poisoning. I mean, that's how it started. I was nauseous. I had vomiting. I was having diarrhea. I just assumed I just picked up a virus or food poisoning. But the next day, I realized I was not feeling so good. And I was like, I don't think this is food poisoning. So I reached out to my primary care provider, and she jokingly said, you realize you know what you need to do. Now, if you've ever been an ER personnel of any capacity, you don't go to the ER unless you feel like you're dying. Mm-hmm. By that point, I was having so much pain. I went to the emergency room with my husband. My kids weren't, 4 years ago, they were like 14 and 12. And so they were old enough to leave at home, but they didn't like the fact that their parents were leaving to go to the ER. That started a 13-day hospitalization. I had a ruptured appendix. and a slew of complications. I had a small bowel obstruction over the course of that 13 days. I had pancolitis. They initially wanted to take me to surgery. And the first thing I said to the surgeon at like midnight was, "You're not taking my colon." She's like, "You don't need it." I was like, "No, I need my colon. I need it. I want you to try to do everything you can to save it." And so all the complications, the first 5 days, I did nothing other than vomit. It was really very unpleasant. And by day 5, my cousin, who's a physician, actually came to stay with me. And I was actually arguing with the doctors. I didn't want them to give me TPN. For anyone that's listening, TPN is total parenteral nutrition. It is all soy-based. And I knew, I knew this from all my years of working in the hospital. I was like, "Oh, I don't want that crap." And my cousin was like, "If they don't give you that crap, you're going to die." Like, I lost so much weight. They had a scale like in part of the bed. And my cousin's like, "You've lost 15 pounds in 5 days. And that was really sobering. And then I had more complications. I developed a fistula. I had some abscesses. I mean, every complication you can imagine I had. And on the 13th day of my hospitalization, I was feeling a little bit better. And my surgeon did not want to take me to surgery. She wanted me to go home. And so I went home, and 27 days after I left the hospital, I did that talk. But part of my recovery mentally was saying to myself in the hospital, the first thing I want is to get home to my boys. And secondly, I want to do this talk, because to me, it demonstrated I wasn't as sick as I thought I was, even though I knew I was that sick. And so I got on that stage and I set the intention, and I just want my kids to know I'm okay. And that was all I wanted. At that point, I just wanted my kids to know I was okay. And so obviously the rest is history, but it's a pretty amazing talk, because 2 weeks after that, 10 days, I had my appendix out. And it was very, very humbling. I think what it really taught me was that through adversity comes opportunity. A lot of people, no one would have questioned if I decided not to do that talk. Not one person. In fact, the organizers thought I was a little crazy, but when they heard me say part of my like mental recovery was stating that I still wanted to do this talk. I think it was really important for me to do that mentally, but I can't actually watch the talk. I can't watch it because I was really not aware of how sick I had been. And so I think anyone that's ever had something traumatic happen to them, you don't realize sometimes until you look back, you're like, wow, like my brain hadn't caught up with my body. It's probably a blessing. And so, I just humbly say that was my opportunity to turn something really unfortunate into something really positive. And so I'm a huge proponent. I say all the time that I'm not the same person I was before that happened. And I think in so many ways, it's been like one of my greatest teaching opportunities. And I tell people all the time, I don't care what you've been through. We all have opportunities to make ourselves stronger. Obviously, I've had a lot of therapy to work through a lot of the things that, I was thinking about while I was there. It's very humbling to imagine being in your 40s and thinking you might die. That could have very easily happened, but it didn't. And so I fervently believe that I'm not afraid of anything. And each day is a new day to kind of take whatever God or the universe has handed us and turn it into something amazing.
Well, I feel like we couldn't end the podcast on a better note.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a strong message. And I think that like your story really shows that the body does have this healing capacity, that, it can be stressed, but on the other side of these hardships, they can heal if you give them what it needs, if you give your body what it needs.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, Cynthia, how you went into that TED talk with the sole intention of just wanting to show to your boys and your husband and even yourself that you had healed and you were okay. And it was like from that intention came the most popular piece of content that you've ever created that's gone incredibly viral. Like, it's just so interesting how God works that in that way.
Yeah. And what's funny is, so that was March. And then I told my kids when I got home, I was like, after my surgery, I was like, hey guys, we're going to have the most laid back summer. We're going to have so much fun. And then in May, the talk got released. And then the first day it had 90,000 views. And one of my friends called me and she was like, I think this is going to be different. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
I was like, I think you need to look on YouTube. And I was like, oh my God. And then it was like, my business wasn't prepared for that. It was almost like an explosion. And from that point forward, really, it was just trying to stay ahead of the curve in so many ways, like just really woefully being unaware of what could really happen. So when people say one talk or one opportunity can change your life, I really believe that. but I'm so blessed and so fortunate because it made a world of difference. And then my husband no longer thought I had a hobby. That was the big thing. He's like, okay, it isn't a hobby. You actually have there's a real business here. So
was there anything that you were doing in the recovery process that stands out other than the TED Talk that was just important for you, like day in and day out? Because I know the days can seem longer when you're recovering from something like that.
I did a lot of sleeping, and I have an Italian mom, and Italian mothers overfeed you. And the only thing I tolerated, I was full carnivore. My mom made bone broth. I ate stewed meat. I couldn't tolerate fish. I mean, I literally just sustained myself on small meals throughout the day. My blood sugar was a disaster. I remember I had a drain that was left in because I had a fistula. And every week I had to go have it imaged to see if they could pull it out. So a fistula is almost like a channel created between two organs that didn't belong there. And I remember just walking from the car, being dropped off in front of this imaging center and walking inside. I was exhausted and my blood sugar was all over the place. And people always asked, did you fast? I'm like, I couldn't fast for months. I was 105 pounds. When I tell you, I don't look healthy, I do not look healthy at 105 pounds. And so I was just so weak. So I slept a lot and, talk about nourishing food. I literally just ate meat and drank bone broth. And that is about all I could handle. I would shower in the morning and I would spend the whole day laying around. I was just too tired. And how I managed to commit a 12-minute talk into my head, I have no idea how that happened. But because I had just done another TED Talk, I knew how much time I needed to kind of make that happen. But yeah, it's kind of totally remarkable, quite honestly.
Well, I would have to imagine, Cynthia, with clients and patients that you work with that are chronically sick or have had traumatic health experiences, that's like a godsend almost, because now they have someone that's incredibly relatable. You've been through something similar and you can actually talk through that perspective. There's obviously the physical component, the nutrition component, then there's almost like a spiritual, mental component to it. And those are all integral to that journey and that recovery.
No, I so agree. And I'll be the first person to say that there's been a lot of therapy and Reiki and energy work and all the things, because I forget the term that my Reiki practitioner used, but it's kind of like the dark night. I mean, there's something that it creates kind of a chasm in your life and you can't ever go back. So for me, I just spent a weekend with my college roommate, who's one of my dearest friends. And I kept saying to her, I'm not the person I was the last time you saw me. I'm such a different person. Definitely. And what I'm drawn to, what I want to experience, how I want to live my life is so different, but also so intentional. I've always been a good person, but the point and differentiator now is I'm very, very, very clear about what I want to do. And there's no ever going back to anything of mediocrity in any capacity in my life. It's rearranged relationships with family and certainly friends. And I don't per se think that's a bad thing. I think that on a lot of different levels, this is the blessing that came out of all of that I just got very, very intentional. And that has made all the difference.
Has it changed your perspective as a mom at all?
Yes. I mean, time is fleeting. Right now I have teenagers. And so, you obviously both have moms, what it's like, I'm sure you probably remember what, the time period is like when you're so opposite gender parent and how your relationships change. I get the bruh, you got a bro hug and, my kids are taller, bigger than me. But yeah, it's precious. I mean, I can't imagine reflecting back 4 years ago if my boys didn't actually. Tomorrow is 4 years ago that I was discharged from the hospital. So I try to always be very cognizant of the fact that, time is precious and my children are precious. They won't always be little. They're not little people anymore. They're both taller than me. But yeah, it just makes me more cognizant of being present and being grateful. And the time that we spend together is so important. I think a lot of us get busy in our lives and we just forget. Every time my kids go to school now, I always think about there's going to be a time that they're off in college or they've moved out of the house. And so really relishing the time and the connection that I have with them, because it's hopefully it lasts forever, in terms of being connected. But the time that they're going to be home with me is, it's getting, shorter and shorter and shorter. So it just makes me savor that time together with them even more.
You mentioned connection, and it made me think of just community and how important that is in the whole picture of health. And I feel like that also is fairly understated. When people talk about health, they don't really talk about the importance of just having people who are of shared values and want the best for you and will be able to like be there for you when you're in your darkest hour. Like, I think just having community and people there to like lift you up and support you is so powerful. Do you, I mean, obviously I feel like that perspective shift happened for you. But how do you, is there anything that you sort of speak to your clients about community? Because I feel like it's kind of hard to like coach someone on that, right?
No, I mean, I think it's important that, I think boundaries are important. I think being very clear about what you tolerate in your personal and professional life is very important. Obviously, some of my closest friends right now are other entrepreneurs. I was part of a very large mastermind that I was a part of for 3 years. And so some of those people are my closest friends. But when I'm talking to clients, really encouraging them that it's more about quality than quantity. Like, I know there are people on social media that are always posting like they're at every party, they're, showing this, they're showing that. And I'm like, well, true connection is less about being amongst a lot of people and more about true deep connection. And so just encouraging people to not feeling a sense of pressure. And I'm an introvert. So to me, like being in a large group of people for days on end can be very draining. I enjoy it. And then I have to kind of go and recharge. So I think it's recognizing like, are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? What recharges your batteries? What does not? I think that's super important. And, finding your community, whether that's an online group, whether that's a community of like-minded individuals, whether that's, going to, there's a Pilates studio that I joined when I joined, lived at, was new to this area where you feel like people like know your name and there's some camaraderie, and that can be, sometimes superficial, but finding true deep connection in different parts of your life, I think is very important. And I think for some people, I have a side business where I help kind of coach people on brand awareness and doing talks and main stage stuff and TEDx. And this individual in particular was talking about how there's so much pressure on not just women, not just men. There's pressure on all of us to appear to be like super perfect on social media, like the perfect family, this perfectly cultivated, coordinated. There's a lot of that. And so I just said, I tire of that. Like, I show very little about my house. I don't show what I drive. I'm very conscientious about that, but there are people that show everything. And if that works for them, that's great. But part of me kind of honoring who I am as an individual is having some degree of privacy, like in home. And so I think for a lot of individuals, it's figuring out what feels authentic to you, what works for you. I have friends that run the gamut in terms of what they choose to share and what's important to them. But certainly I think it's all about finding our authentic voice and kind of leaning into what works for us intrinsically.
Definitely. Well, Cynthia, that authentic voice definitely comes through. We can both attest to that. And we're just extremely grateful for you coming on the show. It's been amazing just talking with you, getting more perspective on nutrition, living life the right way, and appreciate you just opening up and coming on the podcast. It's been amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you.